Snow fell thick and fast over Frost Hollow, the kind of storm that seemed to bury sound itself beneath its weight. The platform boards creaked as Laura stood waiting, her small leather case clutched in gloved hands. She had traveled for days from Missouri, riding train after train, each mile taking her farther from the life she had known, and closer to the promise of a man whose words had filled her with fragile hope. He had written of a house in the mountains, of a hearth waiting, of a hand willing to guide her through winters that could break the strongest heart. She believed him, because she had needed to believe, because the thought of belonging somewhere, anywhere, had carried her through endless miles of track. But as the last of the passengers hurried off into the storm, no one came to meet her. The conductor tipped his hat and vanished into the white. Wagons rolled away, the lamps of the town flickering faint through the snow. Laura was left alone, a figure in a faded cream dress, once meant for a wedding, now wrinkled and thin from travel. The scarf around her shoulders did little against the cold, her teeth chattering as the wind tore through wool and skin. She lifted her head again and again, searching the road, waiting for the sight of a stranger who might smile and claim her name. Instead came the heavy rhythm of hooves, muffled by snow, yet strong enough to stir unease among the few townsfolk who lingered by the station. They stepped back, their eyes lowered, as if some shadow had risen from the storm itself. A man rode in, broad-shouldered, his coat lined with frost, his hat pulled low. His horse exhaled clouds of steam with each breath, its dark hide flecked with snow. The man dismounted without a word, his boots striking the platform like hammers against stone. The station master nodded toward Laura, his voice low. Her. The stranger turned, and his eyes found her like a blade. Laura felt her knees weaken but forced herself to straighten, clutching her case tighter. His voice, when it came, was deep and rough, carrying more weight than the storm around them. Name of the man you came to marry. She swallowed hard, her breath white in the air. Thomas Langston, she whispered, praying the name might unlock her future. The man's jaw did not move, his expression cut from stone. There is no Thomas Langston in Frost Hollow. The words struck colder than the snow. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Only the hollow ache of promises turned to ash. The storm pressed close, the silence heavier than iron. Then he spoke again. You're coming with me. She should have refused, should have demanded answers, but her feet moved when he turned, her body following the strength of his stride, as if she had no will left to resist. He swung into the saddle, then reached a gloved hand down. She hesitated only a breath before taking it, climbing up behind him, her fingers clinging to the rough fabric of his coat. The town slipped away into the white as the horse carried them forward, trees like black fingers clawing through snow. She did not know his name, did not know where he would take her, only that the platform where she had been abandoned no longer held her. The storm swallowed it whole, leaving behind nothing but the faint memory of a woman waiting for someone who never came. The sheriff's office stood at the end of the main street, its windows fogged with frost, and its roof heavy with snow. The ride from the platform had been long and silent, the horses' hooves sinking into drifts while the storm wrapped them in white. Laura had clung to the back of the man's coat, her fingers stiff, her mind racing with questions she dared not speak. She did not even know his name, until they stepped down from the saddle, and the townsfolk whispered it as they passed. Sheriff Silas Granger. The sound of it made her spine straighten, though her stomach trembled with unease. He led her inside without a word, pushing open the heavy wooden door. Heat met her in a rush, the crackle of a small iron stove breaking the hush that clung to the place. The air smelled of smoke and coffee, bitter, but welcome. Laura stood near the doorway, brushing snow from her skirt, her case clutched to her chest. Her cheeks burned from the sudden change of cold to warmth, but her eyes remained downcast. The sheriff set his hat on the desk, the brim dusted with frost, and poured coffee into a tin cup. He handed it toward her. Sit, he said. His voice carried no sharpness, but it was firm, the kind that expected to be obeyed. She moved carefully to the chair, her boots clicking against the wooden floor, and lowered herself. The warmth of the cup in her hands was almost painful at first. her fingers too numb to hold it steady. She sipped slowly, the bitter taste settling heavy on her tongue, but it eased the ache in her chest. "Where are you from?" he asked at last, leaning against the desk. "Missouri," she whispered. "I left my family behind." He studied her, his dark eyes steady, though his face gave nothing away. He nodded once and reached for a ledger on the shelf. He flipped through pages, his finger tracing names. "There is no Langston here. No one even close. Whoever wrote you was lying." The words stung worse than the cold. Laura pressed the cup tighter to her lips to keep from trembling. She had known deep down, but to hear it aloud left her hollow. She set the cup on the desk and folded her hands in her lap. "Am I under arrest?" she asked softly. His brow furrowed. "Your only crime was believing too easily." The room fell quiet again. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window panes. Silas opened the door and let the snow rush in. "You're free to go," he said flatly. Laura rose, though her legs shook. She stepped into the storm, the cold biting instantly through her coat. She moved down the steps and into the street, her breath sharp in her chest. The town was nearly empty, only shadows moving in the white. She walked slowly, aimless, her boots sinking deep, until she found a bench and sank down. The snow gathered in her hair, on her lashes, her body trembling. Still, she did not cry. Across the street, Silas stood at the window. He told himself to leave her, to let the storm carry her away. Yet when he saw her shoulders hunch, her figure shrinking against the cold, something in his chest twisted. He cursed, grabbed his coat, and stepped back into the storm. He crossed the street in long strides, his boots sinking heavy, his breath fogging in the night air. He slipped his coat from his shoulders and laid it over hers. She flinched, then froze. Her lips blue, her eyes wide. "Come back inside," he said. "Why?" she whispered. His gaze swept the snow, the dark street, the storm that threatened to swallow her. "Because I do not have time to bury another fool who waited in the cold for someone who never came." The sheriff's cabin sat on the northern edge of Frost Hollow, a dark shape half hidden by the trees that bent under the weight of snow. The ride from town had been silent, the only sound the snort of the horse and the creak of leather in the saddle. Laura held on carefully, the sheriff's coat heavy around her shoulders, her breath fogging in the cold night air. She did not know what waited at the end of the road, only that it was warmer than the bench where he had found her shivering. When they reached the cabin, he swung down from the horse and helped her to the ground, his touch brief but steady. A lantern glowed faintly in the window, the only light against the dark. Inside, the air smelled of pine smoke and old wood. The heat of a fire reached her slowly, warming her fingers through stiff gloves. Laura stepped across the threshold and stood still, clutching her small case. The walls were lined with shelves, some filled with books, others stacked with tools. A plain table and chairs sat near the hearth, their surfaces worn smooth by years of use. Everything was orderly, yet the silence pressed heavy, as if laughter had not touched these rooms in a very long time. From the back hallway came the soft sound of small footsteps. Laura turned and saw a girl standing in the shadows, no more than 6 years old, with dark braids unevenly tied and eyes far too solemn for her age. She held a doll with one arm missing, clutched tight against her chest. The girl did not speak. She only stared at Laura for a moment, before slipping further into the dimness. "This is Lena," Silas said, his voice low. "My daughter." Laura managed a gentle smile, her lips trembling with the effort. "Hello, Lena," she said softly. The child blinked once, then disappeared down the hallway without a word. "She does not talk much," Silas added. Then he pointed toward the stairs. "Your room is the first on the left." Laura nodded, her throat tight. She carried her case up the narrow steps, each creak of the wood echoing too loudly in the stillness. The room was small but clean, a narrow bed with a wool blanket, a basin near the window frosted with ice. She set her case down and stood for a long moment, listening. The silence here was heavier than any storm, the kind born not of peace but of loss. Later, when she came back downstairs, She found Lena at the table with her doll beside her plate. Silas served stew in silence, his movements spare and measured. Laura ate slowly, though every bite seemed to press against the quiet that surrounded them. The child's eyes never left her, watchful but unreadable. When the meal ended, Laura moved to the fireplace. She knelt, adding another log, coaxing the flames higher. The warmth reached across the room, softening the corners where shadows had gathered. She turned and met Lena's eyes. "Would you like to hear a story?" she asked gently. The girl said nothing, but her gaze lingered. Laura began, her voice low and even, telling a simple tale her mother once told her, about a fox who found its way home by following the stars. Her words filled the space like a quiet song, weaving through the crackle of firewood. When she finished, the room held its silence still, but Lena's lips curved, just barely, at the corners. Upstairs, Silas had paused at the doorway, listening. His face was unreadable, but his eyes softened at the sound of Laura's voice. For the first time in years, the cabin did not feel quite so hollow. The shadows were still there, but they had shifted, eased by the faint glow of something warmer than fire. The wind rattled the shutters and howled across the eaves, but inside the cabin the fire burned steady. Laura sat near the hearth, her skirt spread neatly around her, her hands folded in her lap as she listened to the quiet house. She had been there only a short while, yet she already knew the weight of silence that filled each room. It was not the gentle kind, but a silence made heavy by years of sorrow and words never spoken. Lena sat cross-legged on the rug with her doll tucked against her chest, her solemn eyes fixed on the flames as though searching for something hidden in the glow. Silas moved about the kitchen, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, but he said little. He placed wood by the stove, poured himself coffee, and returned to the table with the same stiff movements he had shown since she met him. Laura wondered if he carried the silence with him like a second coat, thick and impossible to remove. She did not wish to disturb him, yet when her gaze drifted back to the child, she felt an ache to soften the stillness that had bound this family. She leaned a little closer to the girl. "Would you like to hear another story?" she asked, her voice gentle. Lena did not speak, but her head tilted the smallest bit, and Laura took it as permission. She folded her hands and began to tell the tale her own mother once told her on cold nights. It was about a bird with feathers bright as embers who lost its way in the snow, yet found warmth again by carrying a spark from one hearth to another. Her voice was soft, low enough that the words seemed woven into the crackle of the logs. She let the rhythm of the fire guide her tone, rising and falling like the wings of the bird in her story. She spoke of darkness, of fear, of the long way home, and of how even a small flame could keep hope alive when all else seemed frozen. Lena's eyes widened slightly, her lips parting as though she wanted to say something, though no words came. When the story ended, the child's hand moved to touch the edge of Laura's skirt, quick and light, then pulled back. It was not quite a smile that followed, but the faintest softening of her solemn mouth. Laura felt warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. She reached down, brushing her hand over Lena's hair, careful and gentle, not wanting to frighten her. The girl did not pull away. Instead, she leaned, just slightly, toward the touch. Laura blinked back the sting of tears, grateful for a sign that perhaps she could bring comfort here, in this place that had forgotten laughter. At the table, Silas had gone still. He had turned his head without meaning to, listening to the rise and fall of Laura's voice. It reminded him of long winters past, when Elena would sit in that very spot, her voice soft, as she read aloud to their daughter. He had sworn he would never let himself hear that sound again, not from anyone else, not when it hurt too much to remember. And yet here he was, standing motionless, the quill in his hand useless, his chest tight with the ache of memory and something unfamiliar. Later, when Laura rose to clear the bowls, Silas spoke at last. His words were few, his voice rough. "She has not listened like that in years." Laura turned, her cheeks warming, uncertain if she had overstepped. "Stories can sometimes ease the quiet," she said softly. His eyes lingered on her, dark and unreadable, before he gave a single nod. He returned his gaze to the desk, but the hardness in his jaw had eased. Upstairs, Lena climbed into bed with her doll still clutched in her arms, her lashes lowering over eyes that had seen too much silence. And downstairs, as the fire glowed and the shadows deepened, Laura felt for the first time that perhaps she was not entirely alone in the sheriff's cabin. The storm had quieted, leaving Frost Hollow wrapped in a pale blanket of snow that glittered beneath the thin winter Sunday. Smoke rose from chimneys, boots crunched over hard-packed streets, and wagons rolled slow through the square. Life in town moved on as it always did, but whispers traveled faster than any horse. By the time Laura ventured out with Lena at her side, word of her arrival had already spread like fire across dry grass. She had borrowed a plain shawl that Silas had left hanging by the door, its edges worn but warm enough for the walk. Her boots were thin, and her hands trembled as she carried a small list of items she hoped to purchase at the general store. Lena clung to her side, her small hand tucked into hers, the child's solemn eyes fixed on the ground. They did not speak as they walked, but Laura felt the weight of every glance that followed them. The bell above the shop door rang as they stepped inside, and at once the quiet chatter dimmed. Laura lifted her chin, forcing herself to remain steady as the clerk greeted her with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He stacked flour and sugar on the counter, but his gaze darted toward the back of the shop where several women stood near the bolts of fabric, whispering behind gloved hands. "That's her," one of them murmured, not soft enough to hide the words. "The girl who came on the train. No one met her. Mail order," another added, her tone sharp as sleet. "But left behind. A sad story. Or perhaps a scandal. Who knows what letters she wrote? Or to whom?" Laura felt heat rise in her cheeks. She kept her eyes on the counter, her fingers tightening around Lena's hand. She told herself not to listen, but the words pierced through the walls she tried to build. When she finally lifted her gaze, she saw the clerk watching her, his mouth curled faintly at the edge. "Strange business," he said, voice casual but loud enough for others to hear. "A girl traveling all this way for a man who never existed. Mighty convenient that the sheriff took her in plain and in two." Lena stiffened at her side, her small hand gripping tighter. Laura swallowed hard, her throat burning, but she said nothing. She gathered the small bundle of supplies and turned toward the door. Each step felt heavier, as if the stairs themselves had weight. Outside, the cold air struck her face, but it did nothing to ease the sting inside her chest. She led Lena down the street, her breath coming uneven, her heart pounding. The child looked up at her, her lips parting as though to ask something, but Laura gave a small shake of her head. She did not trust her voice to remain steady. They walked quickly, snow crunching underfoot, until the outline of the sheriff's cabin appeared at the edge of town. Inside, Silas was at his desk, his hat pushed back, his brow furrowed as he looked up from the papers before him. His eyes narrowed when he saw the flush on Laura's face and the way Lena clung to her. He did not ask at once, but when Laura set the supplies on the table, her hands shaking slightly, he spoke. "They said something, didn't they?" She kept her back to him, smoothing the edge of her shawl. "It does not matter," she whispered. His chair scraped against the floor as he rose. His voice was low, steady, but sharp. "It matters to me." Laura turned then, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I have been pitied, mocked, ignored before. I can bear it, but I do not want to bring shame to your house." Silas crossed the room slowly, his shadow falling across the hearth. He looked at her, his jaw tight, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then his words came firm, certain. "You are under my roof. That means you are under my name, and no one in this town will call you anything less than worthy while I draw breath." Lena's eyes widened at his tone, her doll slipping from her hands. Laura's lips parted, surprise softening the pain in her face. The fire crackled between them, and for the first time since stepping into Frost Hollow, she felt the faint spark of protection that might one day grow into belonging. The snow had piled higher against the walls of the cabin, and the wind outside whistled through the pines like a restless spirit. Inside, the fire gave a steady glow, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Laura sat near the hearth, with a length of fabric spread across her lap, a needle and thread pinched carefully between her fingers. The fabric was a small wool sweater, worn thin at the elbows, belonging to Lena. Laura had noticed the tear days before and set aside what little thread she had to mend it. The child sat nearby on the rug, her doll tucked against her knees, watching with wide, solemn eyes. She did not speak, but she followed every movement of Laura's hands as if each stitch was a kind of magic. Laura hummed softly while she worked, the tune no more than a faint breath of melody, something her mother once sang in Missouri when nights were long and the cupboards were bare. The sound carried gently through the cabin, filling corners that had known only silence. Silas returned late from his patrol, his boots heavy with snow, his coat lined with frost. He paused in the doorway, brushing the cold from his shoulders, and saw them by the fire. Laura bent over her sewing, her face calm in the firelight, her hair slipping loose from its pins. Lena leaned close, her head resting on her folded arms, her eyes half closed in drowsy comfort. For a moment he did not move, afraid to break the picture before him, afraid to admit what stirred in his chest as he watched. Laura looked up when she sensed him there. "I hope you don't mind," she said quickly, lifting the sweater as though to explain. "It was torn, and I thought I could mend it." Silas shook his head, his voice rough but quieter than usual. "No, I don't mind." He set his gloves on the table and moved to hang his coat, though his gaze lingered on her longer than he intended. The firelight made the cabin seem less hollow, the air warmer not just in body but in spirit. It unsettled him, for it had been years since such warmth had touched these walls. He reminded himself it was only kindness, nothing more. Yet the sight of his daughter's eyes softening as she leaned against Laura, the way the girl's fingers brushed the mended edge of the sweater as if it were treasure, spoke of something he could not ignore. Later, when Lena was tucked into bed, clutching her doll and the patched sweater, Laura stayed by the fire a little longer. She folded her sewing neatly, her fingers lingering over the stitches. Silas sat at the table, his hat turned in his hands. He wanted to speak, to thank her, but words stuck in his throat. At last he managed only, "She hasn't leaned on anyone like that since." He stopped himself, his jaw tight. Laura's eyes softened. "Sometimes it only takes a small kindness," she said gently, "to remind us we are not alone." Silas did not answer, but the silence that followed was no longer so heavy. The threads she had sewn into that sweater seemed to have stitched something deeper, something fragile but real, into the heart of the cabin itself. The morning light filtered weakly through frosted panes, painting the cabin in shades of pale gold and gray. Laura sat by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone lukewarm, when Silas returned from town with the day's mail. He set a small bundle on the table without a word, his shoulders still dusted with snow, then moved to hang his coat by the door. Laura's gaze fell to the letters, most of them marked for the sheriff's business, but one bore her name in careful ink. Her breath caught as she reached for it, her fingers trembling over the seal. She opened it slowly, afraid of what waited inside. The words blurred at first, her vision stung with sudden tears, but she forced herself to read. It was from her cousin Benjamin, back in Illinois, written in the neat, steady hand she remembered from years ago. He had heard of her leaving Missouri, of promises made by men who vanished like smoke, and he offered her a room in his home. "You deserve better than wandering after broken vows," he wrote. "Come back to family and safety. Come back before the world breaks you further." Laura folded the letter carefully, pressing it against her chest as her heart ached. She had thought herself forgotten by kin, thought the ties cut long ago, but here was a thread reaching back, tugging her toward the life she left behind. The cabin seemed suddenly smaller, its shadows deeper, its warmth fragile and borrowed. Behind her, the fire crackled, and upstairs Lena's small voice drifted faintly as she hummed to her doll. The sound pierced Laura's heart, for the letter offered comfort. Yet here she had begun to feel something more. Silas noticed the change in her face, the tightness around her mouth. He stood a few feet away, his hands resting on the back of a chair, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Bad news?" he asked, his voice low. Laura shook her head, though her throat felt thick. "Not bad. An invitation. My cousin writes from Illinois. He says I should come to him, that he has a place for me." Silas was silent for a long moment. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall and the soft whistle of wind against the eaves. "Do you want to go?" he asked, finally. Laura turned the folded letter in her hands, her eyes lowered. "I do not know," she whispered. "I thought I had no place left in this world. Now I find I may have two, yet neither feels certain. One is safe, but empty of what I have begun to find here. The other is here, in this cabin, in the quiet, in the fire, and the child's laughter, but it is not promised to me." Silas's jaw tightened, and he looked toward the window where snow fell steady, hiding the world beyond. He wanted to tell her to stay, wanted to claim that her place was already here, but the words caught in his chest. He feared they would bind him to feelings he had sworn never to open again. Instead, he only nodded once and said, "The choice is yours." Laura placed the letter on the table and folded her hands in her lap. The firelight brushed her face, soft and weary, yet her eyes held a flicker of something new, a question she was not yet ready to ask. For the rest of the day, she moved quietly, mending clothes, tending to Lena, stirring stew at the hearth. But the weight of that letter pressed against her heart like a stone. And each time, she caught Silas's gaze, flickering toward her, brief and guarded. She wondered if he too feared what might be lost should she decide to leave. The storm had returned in the night, laying another heavy quilt of snow across the valley. But inside the cabin, it was not the cold that woke Laura. It was the sound of Lena's cough, thin and sharp, breaking the stillness like the crack of brittle wood. Laura rose at once, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, and hurried to the small room where the child lay. She pressed her hand gently to the girl's forehead and found it hot, burning with a fever that made her heart lurch. Lena stirred, her cheeks flushed, her lips dry as she whispered for her doll. Silas came quickly when he heard Laura's voice. His boots struck the floor hard, his face pale in the glow of the lamp. One glance at his daughter's fevered skin, and his breath caught. He fumbled for his coat, already reaching for the door. "I'll fetch the doctor," he muttered. But Laura's hand caught his arm before he could leave. "You will not reach him in this storm," she said firmly. "And even if you did, there is little he could do that we cannot do here. She needs care, not a dangerous ride through the snow." Silas's eyes burned with fear, the memory of another winter heavy on him. He had seen fever take before, had watched helplessly as a woman he loved slipped away. His jaw clenched as if bracing for another loss. "She is just a child," he said hoarsely. Laura tightened her grip, her eyes steady. "And she is strong, but she needs us calm." He faltered, then let his coat drop back onto the peg. For the next 2 days and nights, Laura stayed by Lena's side without rest. She dampened cloths with cool water, pressing them to the girl's brow. She brewed broth as best she could, coaxing a few spoonfuls past trembling lips. When Lena whimpered in half-sleep, Laura whispered lullabies, soft and soothing, stories of stars guiding lost travelers home, tales of foxes that survived winter by following their own cleverness. Her voice carried the rhythm of comfort, and though the child drifted in and out of fevered dreams, her small hand never let go of Laura's. Silas moved about the house like a restless ghost, bringing firewood to keep the hearth alive, fetching water when asked, his eyes never straying far from the doorway. He watched Laura bend over his daughter, with a patience that steadied the storm raging inside him. Each time he heard her gentle voice, he remembered another winter, another bedside, another hand that had slipped away despite all his desperate prayers. The fear gnawed at him, yet he clung to the sight of Laura's calm strength, as if her presence alone could hold back the dark. On the second night, when the fever burned fiercest, Laura leaned close, her own face drawn with exhaustion. "Please stay," she whispered into the darkness, her lips brushing Lena's damp hair. "I am not ready to let you go." Tears glistened in her eyes, but she did not falter. When dawn came, pale and thin, Lena stirred. Her lashes fluttered. Her cheeks flushed not with fever, but with returning life. Her lips parted, and a single word escaped, dry and fragile but clear. "Mama!" Laura froze. her heart breaking and mending in the same breath. Silas stood in the doorway, his hands gripping the frame as if to steady himself. He heard the word, saw the truth of it, and something inside him cracked open. In that moment, the cabin no longer felt haunted by what was gone, but filled with what had been given. The snow had begun to soften under the weak light of approaching spring, dripping from the eaves and running in thin streams along the edges of the road. Frost Hollow stirred with the sound of hammers on wood and wagons rumbling over half-frozen ground. Yet, inside the sheriff's cabin, time seemed to pause. Laura sat at the small table, her cousin's letter folded neatly beside her sewing basket, its words still pressing against her heart like a stone. The offer of safety, of a place to belong far from here, whispered at her each time she touched the page. But across the room, Lena laughed softly as she braided her doll's ragged hair, and the sound filled the cabin with a warmth no letter could match. Silas returned from patrol, his boots wet with slush, his coat heavy with the day's work. He glanced at the table, saw the letter, and his jaw tightened. For days, neither of them had spoken of it, though the silence between them grew thick. He set his hat on the peg and poured coffee, his hands steady, though his eyes carried the weight of storms long endured. At last he broke the quiet. "Have you decided?" he asked, his voice low. Laura's fingers tightened on her lap. She lifted her gaze, steady though her throat ached. "I thought I had no place left. Then this letter came. My cousin offers me family and shelter. It is safe. It is certain. But—" She paused, her eyes softening as they turned toward Lena. "But safety is not the same as living." Silas said nothing, but his breath came heavier, his chest rising as though bracing for a blow. He had told himself not to hope, told himself she was only a guest who would pass through his world like snow melting under the Sunday. Yet the thought of her leaving cut deeper than he dared admit. Laura rose, the letter in her hand, and crossed to where he stood. She held it out to him, her palm open. "If I go, it will be because I am afraid of what staying means, afraid of wanting too much." He did not take the paper. Instead, he reached for her wrist, gently closing her fingers back around it. "Do not choose fear," he said softly, his voice rough as gravel. "Not again." Her eyes blurred with tears. "And if I stay, what then?" Silas looked at her, truly looked, not as a man who offered protection, but as one who had already been changed. "Then you stay because you choose it, not because you need, not because you have nowhere else, but because this has become your home." Lena stirred at the sound of his words, looking up with wide eyes, then slipping her small hand into Laura's. The child said nothing, but her touch spoke volumes, binding them together in a silence warmer than any fire. Laura folded the letter once more, this time not with trembling but with calm resolve. She laid it back on the table, her hand lingering a moment before she turned. "Then I will stay," she whispered. Silas's shoulders eased, though his face remained guarded, as if the weight of believing was almost too much. Still, when Laura met his gaze, she saw the truth behind his silence. The choice had been made, not just hers, but his as well. The snow melted slowly that year, reluctant to loosen its grip on the valley, but when the first buds pushed through the thawed earth and the streams began to run faster, Frost Hollow prepared for the spring festival. It was an old tradition, older than the town itself, meant to welcome the season with ribbons, music, and bonfires. For weeks the townsfolk had spoken of little else, though whispers still circled about Laura and the life she had made beneath the roof of the widowed sheriff. Some doubted, some judged, but others watched quietly as a change took place in both the man and his cabin. On the day of the festival, Silas stood at the church steps in a coat he had not worn in years, dark and pressed, its seams carrying memories of another life. His shoulders, once stiff as stone, now held a quiet ease, though his jaw still carried the strength of a man used to standing against storms. Laura walked beside him in a simple blue dress, embroidered carefully along the hem with tiny flowers Lena had begged to add. Her hair was braided with wild blossoms, loose strands lifted by the spring wind. She looked as though the season itself had taken shape in her, And when she placed her hand in his, the crowd's murmurs softened into something closer to respect. The square was alive with music from fiddles and banjos, the air heavy with the smell of roasted meat and baked pies. Children darted between the stalls with ribbons trailing, and women laughed as they braided garlands of flowers. Laura felt the weight of many eyes upon her, but she lifted her chin and kept her steps steady. Lena skipped at her side, clutching a new doll Silas had bought that morning, her laughter bright enough to drown out the last of Laura's fear. When the music hushed for the speeches, Silas stepped forward. His voice carried clear, not loud but steady, like the man himself. He spoke not as a sheriff, but as one who had lived with loss and dared to stand again. "She did not come from this place," he began, his eyes resting on Laura. "She came with nothing but a broken promise, yet she brought back something I thought was gone for good." His gaze swept the square. "Hope, my daughter's laughter, the warmth of home. And for that, she has my name, my roof, my hand." The crowd was silent, and even the most hardened faces softened. Laura's throat tightened as Silas reached into his pocket and drew out a small box. Inside lay a modest gold ring, reforged from his past and her beginning, part of his late wife's band and part of the simple one Laura had carried when she first arrived. He slid it onto her finger with hands that did not shake, his eyes never leaving hers. "If you will stay," he said, his voice rough, "not as someone I protect, but as someone I live for, then we are already a family." Laura could not speak, her eyes glistening, so she only nodded. Lena ran forward, wrapping her arms around both their legs, and laughter rippled through the square like the first true breath of spring. That night, when the bonfires burned low and the music drifted into the stars, Silas and Laura walked home hand in hand, the child asleep in his arms. The world was still uncertain, but within that circle of warmth and choice, they had found something stronger than fear, a beginning that no winter could bury. The thaw came slow that year, creeping across the valley in small signs rather than grand gestures. The snow melted from the rooftops in thin silver streams. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, and the fields outside Frost Hollow glimmered with the first shoots of green. In the sheriff's cabin, the change was even stronger, though it could not be measured by weather. It showed in the sound of Lena's laughter chasing across the rooms, in the hum of Laura's voice as she stirred soup at the hearth, in the way Silas no longer sat with his back to the wall as though expecting the world to strike him down. The house, once heavy with silence, had become a place of warmth. Laura rose early each morning, not because she was restless, but because she wanted to greet the day. She coaxed the fire to life and listened to the stir of the wind against the shutters. Sometimes Lena patted down the stairs, hair tangled from sleep, and curled into Laura's lap as she read old stories in a voice that turned plain words into song. Silas often came in from splitting wood to find them there, the sight stirring something in him that no badge or title had ever given. He would stand for a long moment, watching, before stepping forward and letting the warmth of that picture carry into his day. The townsfolk had softened as well. Where once Laura had felt their stares heavy with judgment, now she was met with nods of respect, sometimes even smiles. At the general store, Mrs. Kowalski slipped an extra spool of thread into her bag without charge, murmuring that a woman who could mend both shirts and hearts had earned such kindness. Even the children in town had grown used to seeing Lena tugging at Laura's hand, calling her Lala, with the easy affection of one who knew no difference between blood and choice. Yet the truest change lay in Silas. The man who once lived with his grief like a locked cell now let himself breathe. He still spoke little, still carried the weight of years on his broad shoulders, but his eyes no longer avoided the light. When he returned from patrol, his boots heavy with dust, he did not retreat into silence, but sat with Laura by the fire, their hands sometimes brushing, sometimes resting together in a quiet promise. He had not expected another chance at life, yet here it was, stitched into the fabric of ordinary days. One evening, as spring loosened its grip on the valley, they sat on the porch watching the last light slip over the hills. Lena slept inside, her doll tucked beside her. The world was quiet, except for the distant song of a meadowlark. Laura leaned against Silas, her head resting near his shoulder. "It feels like home now," she said softly. Silas turned his gaze to her, the lines of his face gentler than she had ever seen. "That's because it is," he answered. And with those simple words, the long winters of silence seemed finally buried beneath the promise of tomorrow. If this story warmed your heart, do not forget to subscribe to Western Love Legends for more tales of courage and devotion on the frontier. Leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and help us keep these stories alive. And remember, even a sheriff can learn that sometimes the hardest outlaw to catch is his own heart.